Hey there, everybody. I have to say that today, as I was editing this podcast, I was giving God thanks for each one of you, because there's something about having a routine of doing something every single week in this weird time that we're living in that helps me to stay grounded and continues to give me hope for the future that we're all looking forward to. So in this episode, we're talking about the big question of what's the shared story of future hope, that as we considered the previous questions in the previous weeks about longings and losses and lies and how to make sense of that through the lens of who God is and what we know and believe about who God is, this week we bring those together to really begin weaving a shared story. And as I was editing it, I thought, there was this part of my soul that I thought, gosh, this is all so relational, and this is so hard to be in relationship right now. I hope that as people listen to this, they can think about the ways that relationships are still happening. So that's my encouragement to you. There's a lot that we talk about in this episode that points to relationships, that points to serving in the community, that points to being with other people, that right now we just can't do that. And it's okay. But there are a whole lot of ways that we are connecting with one another by phone, by text messages, by Zoom meetings, getting on Facebook Lives and chatting in that way, doing conference calls. So as you think about the shared story of future hope, maybe before you even listen to this episode, you'll just take a minute and write down in a journal, on your calendar, I don't care where you do it, what's the shared story of future hope? And maybe not even the shared story. What's the story of future hope that when we find ourselves on the other side of this, it's where you want to be and how you want to be living? Because regardless of what's happening all around us, yes, we're going to continue to practice social distancing. Yes, we're going to continue to wash our hands. Yes, we're going to continue to stay at home. Those all need to happen. And even as all of those things are happening, as faithful people, we are people of hope. So I encourage you to think about what's bringing you hope and what is the story of hope that you are living with in this season and you are looking forward to experiencing on the other side of this pandemic. I hope that the stories that Tim and I share will bring you hope, will remind you of the things that are happening around you in your home that are filled with hope. And maybe this episode will remind you of someone that you need to reach out to and check in on. God bless you, and thank you for joining us once again. Here's episode 113. You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 113. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Yeah, welcome to episode 113. So I got a question for you. When have you experienced new life? And Sarah, I'm going to ask you that question. When have you experienced new life?
I may have told this story on the podcast before. I don't know that I have, though. One of the most profound experiences of the resurrection and new life, and no, we're not fast forwarding to Easter just yet. One of the most profound experiences that I had was when I was serving in Cincinnati, and there's a park in Over the Rhine called Washington Park. And the history of that park had been one of violence all the way to murder, police violence. It was a white police officer killed an African-American man in that park. Drug deals, and a feared place, I think, is how I would describe Washington Park. And then as the park was the center of really gentrification happening in that community, there were millions of dollars put into physically restoring that park renovating it, rebuilding it, and a whole lot of things happening around it. And the first spring that the park had opened, and I don't even know that the city had done anything to celebrate that it had even opened at this point, because it was early spring. We had Easter sunrise service in that park. And I will never forget, I mean, it was god-awful early that we're there setting up for worship, and it's dark, and it was kind of one of those mornings that it was kind of misty. And so the whole environment would have been a great environment for fear to be to be bred in the midst of what was happening. And yet what was around us was this beautiful picture and this beautiful experience of God literally transforming a space and a place and the lives of people in that community. And I had the privilege that morning of standing up and preaching about the resurrection in the midst of a resurrection story, a place that for the people of that community, that they had experienced such divisiveness and hatred and hurt, was now a place of beauty and life and gathering and community. And if that's not a story of resurrection and transformation, I don't know what is.
So as you said, Sarah, we're not jumping ahead to the resurrection, but we know that one of the questions over the past few weeks has led us to this place. Last week, we explored what is the spiritual response to the longings and losses and the lies. Now, before we go to this week's question, I'm going to give us a reminder. Throughout Lent, and as Sarah has reminded us in the past, if you're listening to this at some other time other than Lent, it still works. But throughout Lent, we're exploring a series of 5 questions designed to enhance whatever you're already planning for this Lenten season. We're calling this series Step into the Arena. Every week, we'll explore one question with stories and illustrations and leave you with a challenge that you can practice in the midst of your everyday and ordinary life. You can find a link on the show notes page at transformingmission.org/113. That's transformingmission.org/113. Now, Sarah, you want to give us the question for this week?
Our question for this week is, how do you express the spiritual meaning that we explored in episode 112 as a shared story of future hope? How do you express that spiritual meaning as a shared story of future hope? Now, in one part of the work that I do, I would say that's called a revolution. How we say that in the life of the church is that's resurrection. However you want to say it, when we choose to love and live with our whole hearts, over the series of the past few weeks, what we've been inviting you into is to be brave, to show up, to experience perhaps some of those feelings of fear, and at the very same time, feeling very, very alive. So all of those things mixing together. Today, we want to return to the examples that we introduced last week in episode 112 and talk about how we might find the shared story of future hope. If you haven't listened to episode 112, it's okay. We're going to name what those big lies or losses are, and we'll remind you of what the promise of God is. Just know that in episode 112, Tim and I had some conversations about making spiritual sense. In the academic world of church, we call that theology. And so we were having conversations about how God shows up in the midst of these hard places. So you want to get us started, Tim, with the first big lie?
Well, the first big lie that we talked about last week that we will look at is your worth is based on productivity. So love's conditional. And what we're talking about is God's promise is you are God's beloved. So we're talking about writing a new, brave ending, a future with hope. And so we want to practice writing this brave ending together and invite you into it. As we were preparing for this podcast, we were trying to find a way in which we could illustrate some of, you're God's beloved. And I was telling Sarah about an experience I'd had in Peoria. It's wintertime. All the places where the people that live on the street, like that stay at night, like the Salvation Army or the Mission or the Y, allow people to leave at 6 o'clock every morning. I'm saying that they allowed them to leave. They put them out on the street at 6 o'clock in the morning. And so they'd always look for places that were warm to come to. And one of the places that was open was First United Methodist Church. Now, when people gathered at First Church around 7 o'clock every Sunday morning, they had coffee and donuts. And so the folks were coming in off the street to eat the donuts and drink the coffee. And being the lead pastor of the church, I received emails and phone calls about people coming in off the street, eating our donuts and drinking our coffee. That's a quote. So they were wanting to know what I would do about it. We'd been working on being a church of hospitality to the downtown community, and that was not only people on the street, but to businesses and to organizations. And so instead of putting a guard at the door like one person suggested, or we tell people to go someplace else like somebody else suggested, I said, why don't we become a place of hospitality and invite our guests in to sit at the table, and we serve them donuts and coffee, so then they only get what we give them instead of what they can take. That doesn't sound very hospitable, but what we were doing was trying to develop relationships with people on the street. I can go through lots of pieces of that story because the group that usually met in the same room where these people were coming met on the other end of the room. So we had two groups of people with coffee and donuts, and eventually they said, this is foolish. We need to come together. So the people of the church began to meet with the people from the street. At the same time, I had somebody on staff that said, why don't we have a worship service? These people are here. We don't want to waste their time or our time, so why don't we have a worship service? So they started singing and sharing stories. All of that is to say, one of the people who attended that little service that we called the EE service, that was the early service, started at 7 o'clock every Sunday morning, 40 people off the street and 15 or so people from the church. And they would sing some hymns, eating donuts and drinking coffee. One of the people that attended that service lived in the dumpster behind the church. His name was John. John came to the service for lots of reasons. The reason he stayed in the dumpster, though, was because it was a warm place. But he would come to the worship service, and one Sunday he asked if he could sing. Now, no one had asked to participate before, so everyone kind of looks at each other and says, do we try to do this? And so the decision was made, sure, John, you can sing. Now, John had emphysema. He was an alcoholic. He gasped for breath. What's John going to sing? He stood up at that moment, and he sang the Lord's Prayer. There was a transformation that took place. We began to have people from the church begin to attend the early service and see what was going to happen next. There was an anticipation. Now, what we're talking about today, the folks who were coming in off the street were as much God's beloved as the people who gathered there every week. And what we began to experience was God's love in and through people that we'd kept at arm's distance when we invited them to be our guest and we began to worship together. There was a transformation, I would say a resurrection.
So what you just heard Tim illustrate with that beautiful story is an example of how you might lead people to uncover what is that shared story of future hope. Did you hear what he said at the end? Folks began to see one another as God's beloved. They began to seek out the relationship with one another. That's a future with hope. Whereas where it started was, let's get rid of them. How do we stop this from happening? That's transformation. So you might not have an early worship service. You might not be in a place where there is a ministry with people who are experiencing homelessness, that you even have a need for what Tim described. But I assure you, there are places in your community where you can serve in relationship with others. And that would be my encouragement to you. And part of what you heard from Tim is that didn't all happen in 1 week. It was over a series of weeks that as people gathered, as they experienced life together, as they began to worship together, as two groups became one, they began to experience that brave new story together and write that story of hope together. And so our encouragement to you would be to invite a group of people that over a course of, it might be 6 to 8 weeks, you might every week or every other week, find one place that you can go and serve in relational ministry with others. And when you do that, here's all I'll say to you is gather together. I don't care if it's in the church parking lot or in the church fellowship hall, but gather together beforehand and read scripture and pray together, and then head out to serve together and do it in relationship with people. No standing behind counters where you're separated from people. No yard work where you're not interacting with people. Be with people. Come alongside people and be in ministry together. And then at the end of that, before anyone scatters and goes back home, debrief what you did and ask the simple question, where did you see God's love today? And pay attention to what is happening in that moment. That's all you need to do. God will take care of the rest. I can assure you of that. What you need to do is pay attention to how people answer that question. So let's move on to the second big lie.
Big lie number 2. I must call people out on their sin. And what we know is God's promise is we are sinners saved by grace. Maybe I would say it this way. Each of us are sinners saved by grace. So, Sarah, how do we write a brave new ending, a future with hope? How do we practice the brave new ending together when we're saying, I must call people out on their sin?
So the spiritual practice that we named for this one was it was threefold. It was confession, it was forgiveness, and then humility. So what we might suggest here is over a series of a month, come together and explore the following. Explore confession, explore forgiveness, explore humility, and do that each week in a different way. For what we're talking about on this episode, and probably all of these, this needs to happen, but this one especially, I would invite people to set a container. And what I mean by that is helping folks to set the expectations of what behaviors are or norms for the group are going to be present, what's okay and what's not okay. For this one, I'm saying that I'm pausing because we can help you understand what setting a container is all about. Reach out to us and we'll point you to resources. I'm not going to go into the whole dynamics of that on this episode. For this one, because personal examples are going to come up and it's really an invitation to rumble with vulnerability, when we're practicing vulnerability, people need to be assured that they're going to be heard and understood, and what is said is safe to be said. In other words, what is said is not going to be used against them. So if a question is asked of why should I forgive them? Why should I even practice forgiveness? And it comes across as crass or judgmental. You're not going out to your friends who weren't there and saying, you should have heard what Tim said in that meeting. That's not okay. That there are some expectations that are set. So what we're offering here is an example, not a plan. Otherwise, we'd walk you through what setting a container looks like. So here's what you might consider to do over the course of a few gatherings. The first time together, name those expectations together. The second time you're together, name examples of confession and forgiveness and humility from the scriptures. Where do we see those practices laid out? Again, because we're doing this during the season of Lent, I think of Jesus on the cross. And he's got a criminal next to him, and what is he doing? He's saying, you're going to the same place I am. I forgive you. That's a really bad paraphrase, but those of you that have read that scripture, you know what I'm referring to.
I'd say it was a good paraphrase.
So another conversation might be having a conversation with one another about where have you witnessed or experienced forgiveness? The very act of sharing those stories, whether it's forgiveness or confession, I'll include that as I say this, is a practice of humility. And so this isn't about boasting, I forgave 10 people. No, you didn't forgive them if that's how you're saying it. I can tell you that right now, because if it's about how many and how much, you've lost the spirit of what we're talking about here. So it might be a place that you invite people to, quote unquote, do some homework, that throughout the week, practice listening more and speaking less, getting curious with people. Now, when I say get curious, I'm not talking about being nosy. I'm talking about asking the sincere questions so that you can seek to understand what might happen. Another way to approach this might be to physically go to a place of separation or division, to experience something together. So the first thing that popped into my mind for this one was in Cincinnati. There's a place called the Freedom Center, and it's a museum, but really it's an experience of what the Underground Railroad was all about. And then have a conversation about what does seeing and hearing and experiencing some of the stories of people who were seeking freedom mean for you? How are you making sense of that? And this isn't about just going and having an experience and then checking it off of your list. Again, you're looking here and you're listening here for a shared story of future hope. Another way that you might do this, and this might be instead of going somewhere, this might be just another way to approach this, is to think about the people in your community. And this might be an individual or it might be a group of people together that I'm pausing because I want you to hear me carefully say this, who the church has judged. And in doing this, I'm not asking you to step into this so that you can then say to them, you need to confess your sin. That's why we've been judging you. No, absolutely not. Underscore, that is not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying is I want you to think about who you might invite. I'm going to give you a few ideas here in just a minute so that you can reflect and have a conversation about the places that you may have been judgmental, dare I say hateful, dare I say hurtful to others. And you might need to confess your sin and ask God for forgiveness so that you can begin to learn a new way. So I say all of that to say, here's some individuals that you might think about. And I would do this not as a, hey, does anybody know someone who, but as you think about the relationships of the people in your church or the group that you might be doing this with, who do you know that has had an unplanned pregnancy or has experienced an abortion or a miscarriage or infertility? Now you might be saying, okay, Sarah, you just named 4 very different experiences. Yes and no. The first example I offered to you in terms of an unplanned pregnancy, that's something that, I'm sorry, no. The first example that I offered you in terms of going to the Freedom Center, that's a cultural, historical example that we need to consider how we are still contributing to the lack of freedom for other people. Unplanned pregnancy, abortion, miscarriage, infertility, those are topics that bring with them not only stigmas for women and couples that end up causing suffering because they often feel judged or are categorized in a certain way that leads to hurt. And so that's a whole different set. I don't even like saying it that way. I don't know how else to describe it. That's a whole nother group of people that might be experiencing hurt and suffering that you know, and to simply have a conversation and listen to what their experience has been. Now, if that's not been a part of your experience and you don't know someone, please don't post on social media, hey, anybody who's had an abortion, would you like to come talk to my small group? No, please don't. I'm sorry that I even feel the need to say that.
Let me jump in here in regard to confession, forgiveness, and humility. Oftentimes when we put ourselves in the center, which is what happens when we feel like we have to call people out on their sin, we feel like that what we're trying to do is to get somebody else to confess. We're not talking about that. We're talking about we ourselves confessing and receiving forgiveness, being humble enough to be able to do this so that we can be who God needs us to be for the very people who've been separated and hurt and experiencing the anxiety of the things for which you've just talked about. So the confession is not that we're in some kind of power position and we're trying to get people to do something. It's really we're humbling ourselves to be who God needs us to be.
Right. And the humility practice here is to listen with open ears and open heart to the experiences of someone else that is experiencing suffering, that is experiencing hurt and loss, or feeling judged in some way. There's lots of other groups of people individuals that you might have these conversations with. So think about foster parents and the stories that they might share of what they experience with the children that come into their home. And there's certain confidentiality around that. But there's also certain ways that those stories can be shared so that you can have a conversation. Even things along the lines of families experiencing crippling debt, whether it's from medical bills or from college debt or just decisions that were made that have led them down a path that now they find themselves in a very difficult place. Think about people experiencing chronic illness or someone who's experienced incarceration or someone in their family who is incarcerated. Families who are experiencing dementia, or I guess families don't experience dementia, someone in their family that they love who is experiencing dementia, people living in poverty. Those are just some examples. There are other examples in your life and in your context. So think about the places that people are suffering. And if you can't name that place in your local context, that's probably a good indicator of where you need to take a step, or I'd encourage you to take a step of humbling yourself, to ask that question and to truly encounter where is the suffering and the hurt happening in your community? Because I don't care if you have all the resources in the world and all of your basic needs met, there are people that are suffering and have hurts in your community. And if you can't name them, you're not listening. And that's a place that sounded really judgy. I don't intend it to be. I'm simply saying, if you can't name it, this is a place of practicing humility so that you can come to understand. And it might also be a place that you're going to need to seek forgiveness and to confess the places of, can I say it this way? Your ignorance of not knowing. So let me wrap this one up. As you do this, perhaps each time you're gathering, you're offering a prayer of confession together, and you're practicing humility together. The most important part of this is that you're together and you're having these conversations, seeking that shared story of future hope. And that's going to involve naming the places that you've fallen short, recognizing the places where the church has fallen short. Hear me. This isn't about beating yourself up. That's not what confession is. But it is about naming where you've fallen short before God and then seeking that forgiveness. You can't get to that shared story of future hope if we're judging and if we're not being authentic. You've got to experience that transformation to get to that place. So for some groups of people, you might need to sing together. You might need to express yourself with art or writing. Maybe you'll recommit your vows of baptism. All of those are just ideas. You get the point of I hope you get the point of what I'm trying to lead you to, is experiencing and listening to folks so that you can practice the confession, the forgiveness, and the humility so that you can write that brave new ending together.
So we've got another one, another big lie. It's around loss. We can do ministry like we were doing ministry in the 70s. And God's promise is God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So how do we write a new, brave ending, a future with hope, when we're still, and I'm saying it this way, you'll say it better, when we're still trying to do ministry like we did 40, 50 years ago?
Well, if we're going to experience God's promise, what we pointed to in episode 112, and we're illustrating in this episode, is to practice one of the spiritual disciplines. And the spiritual discipline for this one that we talked about was the lament. So for this one will be much shorter than the other two. In terms of an example, it might be an individual practice that you invite people to do over a series of, let's just say, 6 weeks. Repeating every week the same, I'm going to call it a fill-in-the-blank prayer or a Mad Lib prayer. So here's what it might look like. Invite people on a sticky note to complete these 4 sentences and then post it on a wall somewhere in the church so that everybody can see. People aren't putting their names on it. They're just completing this lament. And so it might go something like this. God, I don't understand. And then complete that sentence. God, please fix. And complete the sentence. God, I trust you with my future, even if, and then complete the sentence. God, I will praise you even when. What you're inviting people to do here is to practice the lament, to both name what they don't understand and what needs to be fixed, and also to name that promise of God. So you might invite people to do that, let's just say every Wednesday night if you have a Wednesday night ministry, or after worship each week, at your children's ministry or at your youth ministry. You know the best context in which to do something like that, but doing it over a series of weeks so that people have the opportunity to practice it again and again. Or you might pull newspapers or media clippings and name together what you lament. Or you might walk the neighborhood and use that structure that I just walked you through in terms of what you don't understand and what needs fixing and what you're trusting God with and how you're going to praise God as you walk your neighborhood. Or you might invite the church matriarchs and patriarchs to tell their stories, because they're going to tell a story of a different day, and then name again what you don't understand and what needs to be fixed. Or you might invite your first responders from your community. I'm not saying invite all of them, I'm saying invite one of them to come and talk with you about the needs in the community. Or do that with teachers or principals or coaches. They all have insight and experiences about what the needs are in the community that will help you begin to see that it's not 1970 anymore. There's some things that are happening that the church and people of faith can be helpful in addressing. And our practice here is to show up, to name that, and to also name the places that we're trusting God so that you can write that brave new ending and to name that shared story of a future with hope. So I'll say it. I've said it before. I'm going to say it again, and I'll probably say it one more time before we're done here. This is about setting a hopeful tone. It's not a belly aching session. So listen with ears to the future, to a future that is filled with the promise of God who says, I'm here. I'm the same God as I was yesterday, today, and I'll be the same God tomorrow. Have the outcome of your time together move you towards action of living into that shared story of a future with hope.
So in summary of what we've talked about up to this point, what's the transformation that you desire? Where is the hope? What do you want? What does Jesus teach us about how do we structure an experience to encounter Christ and one another? We're talking about transformation. We're talking about resurrection. And here's where we, if I may say it this way, begin to step out of the tomb and into new life. Sarah, you want to share the challenge for this week?
Yeah, so this week, here's our challenge for you to help you reflect and act on your response to the question, how can we express our shared story of future hope? We're going to walk you through, as we have in the previous weeks, the challenge and invite you to hit pause after we ask each one of these questions, because there's a couple places that you might want to write something down. So I got us started, Tim, but why don't you cover these first two questions?
Okay, the first question is, how does our shared story of future hope begin? Now, if you're uncertain, return to episode 112 and consider how you made spiritual sense of the longings and the losses. So how does our shared story of future hope begin? And the second question is, what hope does God offer to the people entrusted to your care?
So let me just say a little bit more about that first question, and we'll give you an example here in a second. Recognizing God's promise and starting with God's promise as the beginning of the shared story of future hope is important.
It makes a difference where you start.
I was waiting for you to say that. And so we want you to start with Jesus and to start with that promise of God, and not with an opinion, not with...
Well, with those two questions on either end as bookends, consider these questions, and this is the same pattern we've been using. Let's start with your thoughts. What are you thinking about the shared story of future hope? Focus on your current thoughts. One sentence. If you're in a place where you can write it down, do so. If you're in the car, keep it in mind and write it down when you're not driving. So what are you thinking about the shared story of future hope? And second, or what are your feelings? What are you feeling about the shared story of this future hope? This is what again, Sarah is called the vibrations in your soul, and we're really looking for one word or a couple of words to describe this. And then what are the actions? What action is God inviting you to take to embody the shared story of future hope? Now, if your thoughts, feelings, and actions are not having the effect you and God desire, then it's time for you to reckon with what's really going on. This is another place for confession, forgiveness, and humility.
So let me give you one more example with those questions in mind, using this big lie. The big lie is, I can go it alone. God's promise says to us, we're to love one another, to be in relationship. We're created for community. We're created for relationship. The Christian practice or spiritual discipline that we named for this one was to remember our relationships with Jesus, the church, and one another in celebrating Holy Communion by gathering together at the table.
So let me ask some questions. How does our shared story of future hope begin?
This story would begin by recognizing that there's a place at the table for everyone.
So what hope does God offer to people entrusted to your care?
When we're at God's table, we're reminded that we're chosen, we're blessed, we're broken, and we're given in love.
So what are you thinking about the shared story of future hope?
What I was thinking as we were preparing for this is we need to gather at Christ's table for a series of weeks to have conversation, to listen, and to seek to understand more how we express how we're chosen, how we're blessed, how we're broken, and how God is inviting us to be given in love to one another and to the community around us.
So with your thoughts, then comes feeling or emotion. So what are you feeling about the shared story of future hope?
I'm going to say this with 3 different words so that you get what I'm getting at. Privileged, honored, and humbled.
So bringing all that together, what action is God inviting you to take to embody the shared story of future hope?
If I was serving in the local church, to get people together over a course of a month, week after week, to focus on one movement of the communion liturgy, or to use the scripture of the loaves and fish each week so that we can practice listening and learning and sharing our stories, and then gathering the stories not for the sake of an exercise to write down a new story, but so that we can begin to live into a new story together.
So we have something we're going to ask folks to do for this week. What is it?
Yes, we do. But before I do that, do you have any final thoughts, Tim?
Sarah, I get so many things that start going through my mind when we're doing these podcasts. One of the things that I think about, and you hear me say it over and over and over again, and so it just gets old for people, but it's just who I am, and that is the people around me help me be who God has created me to be. Maybe I think sometimes on good days I get to choose who's going to be around me. Maybe on better days, God chooses who's going to be around me. And if I'm in tune with God, if I'm actually in relationship with God in a kind of way that I'm being able to recognize God, then God shows up in some pretty interesting places in the lives of the people around me. And that's what these questions are actually getting at. And for me as an individual, but then what we've offered is how can you do this within a congregation with people in the church so you can relate to your community. It sounds trite, and I'm an old white guy, and you can rationalize it any way you want. But if your congregation isn't related to the community, then why do you exist? I mean, what are we doing? If we're not trying to be related to people so that God can love people through us, or related to people so we can be loved by God. And that's really what we've been offering over these few weeks. And we're not even to Holy Week yet. So just think, when we do get to the resurrection, there's new life and there is a future hope. And actually, we can't do anything about it at that point except believe it or not. So here we are.
So this week, I'm going to invite you to practice asking the question, what is the beginning of our shared story of future hope? Another way that you might ask that question is, what's the promise of God that's guiding you? Up until now, I've been asking you to answer these questions on your own. This week, I want you to ask others, because that's the only way that this becomes a shared story. It's not your story. This is God's story. That as a leader, you have the privilege of guiding people to come up with and to listen for and to live into what God's brave new ending is going to be, what that future with hope might look like. So to do this, you're going to need to hold your longings, your loss, or your big lie in mind, and the promise of God in mind. And as you consider your longing or loss or big lie, and you consider trusting God's promise, ask that question. What is our future hope? Answer it in a meeting. Answer it before your feet hit the ground and you get out of bed. Answer it before you say goodbye on a phone call. Maybe you'll even put it in an email to someone and say, I want you to think about something. Because when we get together for lunch, I'd love to hear what you say. Because as you're talking with friends, as you're gathering with your family, as you meet people from the church, and as you listen to the stories in your community, you're going to have the opportunity to communicate a shared story of a future with hope that God has already written. It's called resurrection. So when you do this, you're going to step into the arena that we call life, aware of who God has entrusted to your care, and focused on that shared story of future hope that God is already writing with you. So go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.